Monthly briefing. We're really excited about our guest today, who's both a supporter and a critical ally of Ruby. You'll hear a little more about her in a moment. I want to mention a couple of things. We're going to try to get in the habit of mentioning these things at our briefings, which is that some of you have heard of Community Works, one of our signature programs, our trust building initiative that's underway. I want you to know that we now have a briefing on Community Works, essentially an introduction to Community Works, that is every fourth Wednesday of the month at 6:30 Eastern. It's a 1 hour discussion with Meredith Dean, who runs Ruby's Community Works program. Jackie, if I'm wrong about that, correct me, but I'm pretty sure it's the fourth Wednesday of the month at 6:30 Eastern. You can sign up for it at our website, and it's just a way of learning more of the details of Community Works and maybe considering launching it in your own community. Also, just to mention a shout out that in this incredibly critical year, many of you are no doubt giving generously to candidates, campaigns, and other groups. We need support as well and would love to have among our many subscribers more folks who are also monthly donors or just able to give what they can. So just a little plug for that as well. So let's jump in. Thrilled to have as our guest today to lead us through a discussion about the field of rural progressive organizing, Sarah Jaynes. I've known Sarah for the last 2.5 years. She grew up in Washington State on the Olympic Peninsula and pretty early on got into progressive organizing, starting, I think, with environmental issues and climate change, but then taking on many other issues as well. You'll hear Sarah's a straight talker, a good rural gal. She's a no BS straight talker, and she's taken the experience of that into organizing around some of the more challenging issues that we face as a nation and that are faced by many rural communities. Our own experience of Sarah began a little more than 2 years ago when Ruby was big enough to start seeking financial support. And we were turned on to the Rural Democracy Initiative, which Sarah is the executive director of and co-founder of. And RDI has been a core financial supporter of Ruby ever since. And not only that, but an incredibly important connector between our work and I would say most of the other progressive rural organizing work that is underway in this country. Lots of good groups, each has its own kind of niche. And Sarah is the glue. Sarah and RDI are the glue, as well as kind of an incubator for rural efforts all around the country. So she and Rural Democracy Initiative are absolutely central to the effort that Ruby's part of, which is to rebuild prosperity in rural and to sort of rehabilitate the politics of rural as well. So with that introduction, welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much. I am thrilled to be here, and I just really appreciate everyone making the time the day before a beautiful summer holiday to come talk about rural politics. I try to never plan any sort of webinar like this for the summer because nobody shows up, so I'm incredibly impressed with you all and appreciate you having me. As Anthony mentioned, I'm Sarah Jaynes. I'm with the Rural Democracy Initiative, which is a collaboration of funders who are investing in building power for progress in rural America, and thereby changing really what's possible in this country overall. I was planning to speak in 3 segments for about 20 minutes and then have time for discussion and questions about, number one, why rural voters have so much potential and the incredible network of groups unleashing this power that we work with. Secondly, some of the rural, state, and rural district candidates to watch. And third, some highlights from our recent rural poll. So now, especially after last week, you're probably tuning in with a lot of anxiety about what's ahead. I'll say that I've worked in politics for 30 years and won a lot in some really tough circumstances and managed to somehow remain hopeful and relentless throughout. And so I recommend 2 things. The first is that you always want to find the gaps. There's high impact places where you can make a unique difference, and that's where you want to lean all the way in. And then number 2, just don't spend your limited energy worrying about the things that we can't control. So you all, just by virtue of being on this call, have the opportunity to help fill one of the big critical gaps, which is investment in rural people and places. This is RDI's mission. First of all, we're a grant maker. We have 150 grantee partners in small towns and rural areas across 20 states. And these are really skilled, scaled operations doing incredible high impact work on the ground. They're doing civic engagement, organizing, politics, communications, policy change. So I hope just knowing that all these groups are out there doing this work at scale gives you heart. And then we're also a learning community and a capacity builder working alongside our grantees. And we've learned a lot over the past 5 years. And I'll say we're really ready for this moment. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for some of the big lessons here. All right, can you see my screen? Okay, so the first lesson is that rural voters are the most persuadable voters that we know of. In the last 10 years, they swung 8%, which is more than any other major geographic segment. And so maybe what most sets our network apart is that we really know how to talk to the broadest base of persuadable working class people, because every single one of our groups has to work across divides to make things better for their rural communities. The second thing is that rural folks are really for progress on our key issues. So last fall's abortion ballot measure in Ohio showed again that rural people support a woman's right to make decisions about her own health care. We win 70% of our rural school board fights against book bans and for accurate education. And rural folks are passionate economic populists for cheaper prescription drugs, tougher regulations on Wall Street, things like that. And also, as you see in this map, 1 in 4 rural residents are people of color, and these numbers are growing fast. They're different people of color, Black folks more in the South, Latino folks more in the Southwest. These numbers are growing fast. Then on the challenges side, disinformation is especially potent in rural areas because people are highly relational and they get their information mostly from local news, but then from Facebook, where they are just relentlessly targeted. And so experts tell us that a lot of the disinformation that urban audiences see actually got its start in rural communities, where it just spreads like wildfire and it gains strength, and then it becomes much harder to snuff out in other communities. And then just last lesson here is that 63% of rural youth are either infrequent or uncommitted voters. So that's 30 million people. And of all demographics, they are the most undecided and also the least contacted, especially young rural voters of color who lean towards Democrats. We found the best way to activate these voters is through trusted people in their local community. And that's why we started our Rural Youth Voter Fund to move $10 million to nurture the real promise of rural young people. So with that, I'll just focus on this year's election. A fundamental RDI premise is that gains of 3 to 5% in small towns and rural areas will swing statewide outcomes. So you don't have to necessarily win outright. You can move outcomes across the state just by boosting those percentages. And this is exactly what happened in 2022 in Pennsylvania, when rural voters moved 2.4%. And then this swing resulted in a rural gain of more than 110,000 votes total, which is the margin of victory for Fetterman. We also saw this last fall, where rural and suburban Ohio voters swung the most for abortion rights. 9 out of 10 of Ohio's top swing counties were rural for abortion. And then last spring, rural and small town voters in Wisconsin moved 5% towards Protasiewicz for Supreme Court, which accounted for 42% of her statewide votes, which was more than if you combine Milwaukee and Dane County in the Madison area together. And then when the groups in our network invest in high quality local candidates and combine it with deep year-round local organizing, often their candidates do win outright. And these local candidates mobilize their base around really practical issues that touch their communities' everyday lives. And then when these motivated voters turn out to propel these local leaders who they know personally to victory, and in some cases, like in Michigan, they can flip the whole state legislature with these local races. Then those voters, while they're at the ballot box, they vote up the ballot, and that's how they move statewide results. And then the last thing I just wanted to say about our network is that these rural groups are really on the front lines of a pitch battle to ensure that everyone can get over the barriers to vote and have their votes count, which is often more pronounced in rural places. So they're out there making sure there are drop boxes on native reservations in Arizona, that polling places in rural Georgia and North Carolina are safe and joyful places for Black and Latino voters with music and games. Really recruiting young people in rural Wisconsin and making sure they're introduced to the process, maybe as poll workers. And then that small town elected officials and local media and community leaders across the state are prepared to defend democratic outcomes come November. So we've seen since 2020, RDI's grantees have really figured out which tactics have the biggest effect, educating and persuading and turning out voters. And so we just have to make sure that they have the resources and the people power to scale up to be a major force in 2024. Because this year, the Senate map is squarely rural territory. You've got tough states like Montana and Ohio, along with all the super close states we helped win in 2022, like Pennsylvania and Arizona. And then the presidential battlegrounds like Wisconsin and Michigan and North Carolina are all almost half small town and rural voters. So that's kind of the end of my section about the Rural Democracy Initiative Network. And Ruby also wanted me to talk about rural candidates, which I'm very happy to do, but I'll just give a disclaimer that my focus is really always has been on the groups that are in their districts rather than knowing all the details about these candidate campaigns. But I'll ground a conversation about candidates in 5 principles. The first one being, surprise, surprise, that you want to make sure that you're investing in grassroots groups working on the ground to mobilize and persuade voters in these states and districts, not just the candidate campaigns, because after the candidate wins or loses, it's the power that these groups have built that endures and really fuels real change, no matter what the electoral outcome is. I'll just run through the rest of these principles quickly and then unpack them for you. So number 2 is, especially when it comes to giving money, don't put it where everyone else is, or you can really start to get diminishing returns. The third principle is start with local races. Number 4, be sure to adopt at least one rural congressional race to get involved with. And number 5, shore up as many state governments as possible. So for the don't go where everyone else is principle, I'll just turn quickly to the Senate. We are lucky. John Tester, Sherrod Brown, and Ruben Gallego are each truly spectacular rural state candidates. These are tough states to win, but they are extra authentic people who have managed to stay popular while grounded in progressive values, and they are just perfect fits for their voters. So they really should win. And I'll just say their campaigns are going to have so much money. And so these are the places where the grassroots groups, Western Native Voice in Montana, ruralorganizing.org in Ohio, Rural Arizona Action, are really your best bets for getting involved. Now, if Biden doesn't win, and I know it's been a very emotional roller coaster past week, so we'll see how everything shakes out. But without the vice presidential tiebreaker, we'll need to win one more Senate seat for a Democratic majority. So I just put 2 long shots up here. The first is Dan Osborne in Nebraska, a labor guy who led a high-profile strike against Kellogg. He's an independent, and he's running an unconventional but really excellent campaign, and his polling is intriguing. He is pretty darn close. So we need to win that second electoral vote in Nebraska to get to 270 for a Democratic ticket. So Nebraska's worth national attention anyway. And then I'm just going to put my personal favorite out there, Colin Allred, running against Ted Cruz in Texas. He's the real deal. Current congressman and former NFL linebacker and civil rights attorney. He's the one who physically stood in front of the Capitol rioters to defend his colleagues in Congress. He took off his jacket and stood there in defense. He's a perfect profile for Texas if it weren't such a tough year. So those are my Senate votes. I'll move on to my second principle, which is a premise for RDI, which is voters in rural areas and small towns, they know their mayors and county council members, sheriffs, rural electric co-op board members. They know these folks personally, and these folks have huge impacts in their lives with zoning and public safety and immigration enforcement and their electricity rates. it's incredibly meaningful when these rural voters see Democrats in these positions having their backs in their communities. And these local candidates, if they run hard, they can be absolute voter turnout machines. Their friends and neighbors might have zero connection to national politics, but they'll turn out for their friends, and then they'll vote up the ballot for the statewides and the presidential races. And then with the presidential and Senate majority, 50-50 at best, sadly, Democrats need to control one branch of government to stave off a worst case scenario. And the House provides the clearest path to do that this year. There are at least a dozen fantastic toss-up rural races in the House. And so everyone here should just choose one. Just pick one, adopt it, one congressional race, and do everything you can. These folks need your money and your time. And I'm listing 5 just for discussion's sake. Representatives Mary Peltola, the first Native Alaskan and first Democrat in 50 years to hold the statewide Alaska House race, and Marie Glusenkamp Perez, an auto mechanic and young mom in Southwest Washington, where I'm from, are iconic rural leaders who are making waves in Congress, and they're defending the toughest seats this year against really terrible opponents. And then there's 3 pickup opportunities that I'll just lift up. 2 rematches are close races from 2022 in upstate New York and southeast Arizona. And then Lauren Boebert's old seat in western Colorado, where she actually switched out of this district to run in an easier one in the 4th district of Colorado. But Adam Frisch, who ran against her last time, he never stopped running since he lost by 500 votes in 2022. And that's going to be a barn burner. And then, again, thinking about the worst case federal scenario, we're really going to need strong progressive leadership in as many states as possible to protect our rights and our democracy and get us through the next 2 to 4 years. And state governments have profound impacts on people's lives. Think about abortion and healthcare, schools, civil rights, and we have a great chance to move states into democratic governance. So the first one is we need to hold the North Carolina governor's race, where Josh Stein is running to replace Roy Cooper against a truly terrifying current Republican Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson. And then New Hampshire actually has a chance to replace Republican Sununu with Democratic Manchester Mayor Joyce Craig. The Republican primary hasn't happened yet, so we don't know who her opponent would be. But those are exciting governor's races. And then meanwhile, Michigan needs to hold their slim Democratic legislative majority that has accomplished so much for their state. And then New Hampshire and Arizona have a great chance of flipping their state legislatures and could actually achieve Democratic trifectas. Each house is Republican just by 1 or 2 seats. And then in North Carolina, they need to stop the 1-seat Republican supermajority, which currently has the power to override the veto of their Democratic governor. And they've got a good shot at that. So those are the state races. And those are my candidate recommendations, which we can talk about more of them later and dive into more detail during the discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing that this slide deck, and then I have just 5 minutes of highlights that I want to show you on our recent rural poll. We've got the full poll results up on our website, so we can all take a quick breath while I switch my screen to share the view from the website. And then I'm just going to run through 7 top takeaways there. So I'm going to stop sharing this one.
As Sarah's making that transition, I'll just remind folks, if questions are coming up for either of the first 2 segments of what she discussed, please feel free to put them in the chat or jot them down so you can ask them when you raise your hand.
Sounds good. Okay, I'm going to start sharing this one. Hopefully you can see it now. So we did this poll in April, surveying 1,700 voters in small towns and rural parts of battleground states. And I just have, it takes longer to go through the whole poll, but I'm going to give you 7 top takeaways. And I'm going to start with the bottom line, which is rural voters are highly undecided. So if you look at this slide, it's a little bit busy, but on the top line here, you see that 15% of rural voters overall are undecided. If you look at independent women, BIPOC folks, 18 to 29-year-olds, you got like 28% of BIPOC voters, 24% of rural 18 to 29-year-olds are undecided. So when I talked about moving 3 to 5% of votes and adding up to statewide impact, this is where you're going to get those votes, is from these undecided segments of the electorate. So my second point, this is also kind of a busy slide, but many rural voters are under-contacted. So we asked them, in the past few elections, can you recall being contacted by someone representing a candidate in any of the following ways? And then we listed all the different ways that you could be contacted. If you look at these pink squares down at the bottom, these are folks who have not been contacted in any of those ways. And again, it's rural BIPOC folks and 18 to 29-year-olds that are at 22 and 24% uncontacted. Now, why is that a big deal? It's because when they actually hear from campaigns, they actually move towards Democrats. So I'll show you an interesting thing that even just happened over the course of our poll. We asked people at the beginning of the poll and the end of the poll whether they were supporting Biden. And just from the beginning to the end of the poll, just having a chance to talk about politics for 20 minutes with a pollster, they moved 2 percentage points. And if you look, that was driven by BIPOC voters who moved 6 percentage points, these very uncontacted people, independents, and 18 to 44-year-olds. So it's important that we get out there and talk to folks. All right, another very interesting finding is about abortion. So rural voters support abortion rights at stunningly high levels. Again, this is from rural battleground states, or battleground states rural voters. We asked them twice. First of all, we asked them which statement comes closest to your views on abortion. Either I personally support the right to abortion and believe it should be legal and available, which is 35%, or I'm personally against abortion, but I do not believe government should prevent someone from making that decision from themselves, 43%. So combined 77% in favor of abortion access. And then we asked, do you agree or disagree we should trust women and their doctors when it comes to abortion, not politicians? 51% strongly agree, 74% total agree with that statement. So there's a lot of room there around abortion sentiment. All right, my next takeaway is that rural people are economic, populist progressives who are concerned about rising costs. So I have to go back on that one. So here are the rising costs. Housing, the #1 rising cost that people are concerned about. I'm sure you all have heard this in other places. And then the care economy, healthcare, childcare, senior care, and then education are the costs that are on people's minds. And then I'm going to show you this other one, which is a lot of different statements, but one of the tools that RDI offers, which is also on our website, is a Rural Policy Action Report, which is a guide to the most popular policies with rural people. And we tested virtually all of these policies, and as suspected, they all garnered strong support. But the top 5 were all these rural economic populist policies. So cracking down on drug companies that are price gouging for essential medicines, expanding work-based learning and apprenticeships to help prepare students in small towns and rural communities for today's in-demand jobs, restricting foreign ownership of farmland in the US, requiring all meat and meat products to be 100% born, raised, and slaughtered in the US to qualify for Made in the USA labeling, and creating good-paying apprenticeship programs for workers to learn new skills and trades. These were our top testing out of everything. And then I also, because we work, I don't know if, I think you've had a briefing on the winning jobs narrative here. I also wanted to point out that they favor a pro-worker, middle-class out agenda that the winning jobs narrative recommends. So we ask people, when it comes to the economy, which do you agree with more? The first one, we should invest in policies that lower costs and raise incomes for working people. Hardworking Americans are the engines of our economy. The second one is kind of the Republican top-down, trickle-down economic policy. We should keep taxes low for everyone and reduce burdensome regulations on businesses, and that will make America more competitive, grow the economy, and create greater opportunity for all. So you can see 57% overall of rural voters favor the middle out, pro-worker economic policy. Now, the interesting thing, and this is really important, is that once you add partisan attribution in, the support drops by 19 percentage points. So if you assign a Democratic partisan attribution to the middle out and a Republican to the top down, suddenly you see the support flip. And the same thing happens when you read rural voters, two different profiles, a rural and a city candidate profile, which we did because we wanted to test this kind of partisan drop off. Let's see, where is that? That was on number 16. So we had this candidate profile. Candidate A grew up in a rural area in your state. He values his Christian faith, gun ownership, support for workers. And then we had a city candidate, grew up on the East Coast. He's a businessman. He can finance his campaign with his personal wealth. He says there should be lower taxes and fewer regulations. So without partisan attribution, the rural candidate gets 65% of the vote. But as soon as you put a Democrat label on that person, you lose 18 percentage points and it's down to 47%. So I think it's just important to know that rural people agree with us on issues. They have some challenges overcoming their partisan preconceptions, and that is the essence of our struggle here, I would say. So then the last 2 points I just wanted to say before we throw this open for discussion is, well, okay, who are they going to trust? And so we asked at the end, who do you get your information from? And as you can see here, in addition to people's friends and family, we always say the messenger is more important than the message. They also want to hear from veterans, farmers, small businesses, and local law enforcement. And that's why at RDI, we put a lot of investment into veterans groups, farmers groups, small business organizations. These are the best messengers for people in small towns and rural areas. And then I'm throwing this one in there also. And again, you can look at in depth at all these slides on our website at ruraldemocracy.org. But I also wanted to show that local news stations, local newspapers, and radio are really important news sources. We tell folks you should use every single news outlet available to you, that people are reading them. And then for people of color and young people in rural places, you have to reach them on social and digital sources. I think it's very telling. 62% of BIPOC rural voters, 73% of 18 to 29-year-old rural voters get their election news from digital sources. And if you look down here in more detail, a lot of people are getting it from YouTube and TikTok, not from Facebook, in places that we're not necessarily already thinking about advertising. So there's lots more to talk about in this poll, but I'd really love to get to your questions and discussion. So I'll let you just peruse it on our website. Again, that's at ruraldemocracy.org. You can look at it at your convenience. And I'm going to stop screen sharing and we can talk.
Sarah, thank you so much. That was excellent. Super well organized. Lots of really good information, pretty digestible, even though it was a lot of it. Just wonderful, wonderful. So I want to just go ahead and open the floor. Erica's going to be scanning the chat. And Jackie, if we could go to the gallery view so that we can see if somebody raises their hand physically or uses the raised hand icon, that would be great. And then I guess I can move us to that. I can move me to that. That's cool. So we do have several raised hands already. So I'm going to go ahead and ask a few of the raised hand questions while Erica is looking over the chat to find some additional ones. I will ask, because we have limited time, that everybody focus on their question. Try to avoid making really lengthy statements. And then we can get to more folks. So we will start with Kirk.
Thank you very much, Anthony. And also, Sarah, thank you. My question has to do with exerting influence versus exerting power from an organizational sense. My observation over many decades has been that there are too many allied organizations that share values, but they share little else, and consequently, they don't aggregate the power needed to meet the moment. meaning to compel outcomes as opposed to wish for them. So I would like your thoughts about, from an organizational power versus influence standpoint, how do you aggregate all of these resources at the various local levels, probably represented by all the viewers here on the Zoom. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm a lifelong organizer and believe in power, that people need to have power to influence decisions in their communities, and that you get power by working together and organizing. So grassroots power, I think, is the best kind of power, especially when you're in a small town or a rural community where people know each other, where you're working with like a relatively, small population, and elected leaders or decision makers in your community that are accountable to them. So, I mean, the groups in our network, the 150 groups that I mentioned, many of them are working in like a particular geography. Maybe they're working in like one county or a set of counties in a rural part of Arizona or Michigan or Virginia, right? And so they're mobilizing kind of a mass movement of people. They are developing leaders from that group of people to run for office and represent folks. They are mobilizing around a particular issue. So maybe it's that they want to get driver's licenses for immigrants in their community, or maybe they want to make sure that they don't have a carbon pipeline going through their community, whatever it is. So they figure out who the decision maker is, and they get 100, 1,000 people. They find people who are influential and they exert them towards that decision. And what we have found, that's the kind of year-round organizing that is powerful, because when you get 1,000 people who understand that they are now agents of change, these people vote, they run for office, and they will vote for people even if they are Democrats, even though they are inclined to not like Democrats, if they are the ones who are moving policies forward for them. So we were just at a site visit in rural North Carolina where we met with a bunch of different groups that were doing this work. And the thing that most stood out to me was all these folks who didn't think of themselves as being political, right? They're just like people who wanted something good for their community. When they discovered that they had agency, it changed their lives. It changed the whole way that they think about themselves and kind of their mission as a person. And they got their friends and family involved. It's a really powerful thing. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Sarah. We're going to go to Brad next. And I want to say, for people who are unfamiliar with it, usually on your toolbar at the bottom of the screen, you will see a button that says reactions. And if you click on that, it will give you the option of the virtual raised hand icon. You can also just raise your hand.
Okay. How's it going?
Good.
So thank you very much for a wonderful presentation and a lot of great information. Where do you see radio and billboards coming into the picture, or did I miss that on one of the screens?
No, radio is, I think, really important, rural radio. So on our Where Do People Get Their Information, it's right up there with local newspapers. So I think a lot of folks who live in cities don't realize how much radio listening goes on in the country. And I am a huge fan, actually, of buying radio stations. So radio stations, I mean, if you're rich, are not that expensive compared to other news sources. And they turn a profit. So they're not a dying medium. They're cheap to run. They turn a profit, and you can just keep running your country music or your sports radio or your talk radio programming, and actually then just put some news at the top of the hour. So I think that our side should actually be buying assets as much as possible, and then all the advertising money goes to us, right? But also advertise and also just seek news stories. And then billboards. I love billboards. The thing that I really love is yard signs. So you've probably heard from ruralorganizing.org and their work to get up yard signs that are values-based, that help people in rural areas identify kind of who is on our side. And this can be so incredibly powerful because people know where everyone lives, right? And so when you see a yard sign, you know who is behind that yard sign. So it really gives people permission to start having opinions, organizing together. It's like a first stage of civic engagement. So we believe that they're like, it's like a relational communications opportunity, yard signs. Billboards too, but I think yard signs, you can just get more of them out there, and they're so personal.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to ask two more questions from people who've raised hands, and then let Erica summarize or collate some of the questions we have in the chat. Let me also mention that well over a year ago, we had Lark Kobe talk about the work of Public News Service. I won't go into it except to say that they're radio focused, and they're in hundreds upon hundreds of rural radio stations providing kind of progressive news content in a succinct way. So check out Public News Services. Leslie.
I'll also just say about Public News Service, we actually have a contract with Public News Service where we pay them to put together 100 news stories a year on rural radio. And so if anybody here has a good news story, we're feeding stories to Public News Service every week that they love to cover. So just let me know.
Great, that's wonderful.
Fantastic.
Go ahead, Leslie.
Good reporting coming out of Kansas and the region around Nebraska and so on. So that's great to hear. There's a woman, and I can put her Substack in the chat, named Jess Piper from rural Missouri. And Jess's important voice and her big point to make, and the reason she's not running this year, is the high cost of running. And so when you were talking about how you were focusing and looking for the gaps, that really resonated for me. Especially true in Kansas, where we have a hard time fielding competitive races for people to pick from. So I wanted to ask how you're approaching state tables working. I've been pushing this and trying to get this and trying to get it might be C4s, might be C3s, but in any case, non-campaign loci around this and moving resources in ways that we quit, hurting each other by seeking the same funds and repeating ourselves too much in our work. Can you talk about state table successes that you're seeing in other states?
You mean state donor tables?
Yeah, state donor tables. And then sometimes it's happening from groups like you'll get a league of women voters, say, coalescing with the ACLU, coalescing with some other faith-based groups.
Well, so I used to run the state donor table in Washington State for 13 years. That's what I did before I came to Rural Democracy Initiative. And so I love state tables. They call me like the grandma of the state tables. I was the longest serving state table director and helped start about a dozen of them around the country. So I'm a big fan of that model. And I really believe that you need, you need to have a set of donors who are invested in the local races in the state year in, year out, who are really protecting that campaign infrastructure. The Washington State table had a program called the First Mile, and it was specifically bundling campaign money for down ballot races. It was specifically for candidates of color in Washington State, but you could do it kind of for any subset of candidates. And so these are your city council races, your county races, your public utility commissioner races, where they really need like $5,000 to be able to run a successful campaign, $10,000. And we have, there's a lot of rich people who, like I said, they're putting all their money into Sherrod Brown's race. Well, I love Sherrod Brown, but he's going to have so many tens of millions of dollars. He doesn't need somebody's, $100 contribution. That can be transformative for some of these down ballot candidates. So I would highly, it's our most popular program in Washington State politics. It's called the First Mile. I would highly recommend pulling something like that together, and you get a group of donors together, and they pledge, say, each one's going to give $5,000 over the course of the year into a set of your top 15 local candidates. You can do so much good with that money.
Excellent. Murray.
Thank you. Quick question related to your comment about when Democrats are named as Democrats, that turns the poll against Democrats. Where do you, and that's related to a question in the chat too. Where do you think that comes from, and how should Democrats combat that?
Well, my favorite way to combat it is the Community Works program that Ruby runs. Anthony and I have long been scheming together on that program. My belief is that people need to see that Democrats are people like them that they know in their communities, and that these are hardworking people that show up and who help people and put their shoulder to the wheel. And that most people, I think, because of the decline in Democratic winning over the past couple of decades, they don't know who Democrats are. They don't see any Democrats who are working for them. When they think about who has their back, they don't think about Democrats, and they think about Democrats as being somewhere else, and just being weirdos who live in cities and talk crazy. And so I think it's just really important for people to run, especially for local offices that are more nonpartisan, and for people to show up. And I just think community service is the way. And advertise. Like, I think Democrats should sponsor the local rodeo and logging show and the Little League teams. Like, we just need more Democrats just being normalized in regular life, because the fact is that they're all over rural America and people just don't know it.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for the plug for Community Works. I'll also mention that Ruby has had a monthly column in The Nation since April. We've had, I think, 4 published articles now that either Erica or I or both of us are writing at this point. And a lot of what we're doing there is kind of getting to bits and pieces of why Democrats face so much hostility, but then also what we can do about it. So if you don't follow The Nation, it'd be a good thing to do. We're going to switch now. People who've been waiting in line with their hands raised, sit tight. We'll get to you. Erica's going to pose some of the questions that have come from the chat.
Okay, well, first, just a handful of logistical ones that people would like your contact information. They would like to know whether you'll be able to send your slideshow to folks afterwards, or I mean, we'll send it for you if you send it to us. I did already post in the chat the link to the poll, all the poll stuff that she was talking about and all those images. That's already in the chat for people who want to see that. And then people would like to know what is the process if they want to get in touch with you to try and get some support from RDI if they're running in this cycle. Is that still a possibility? And how do they start that process? That's probably enough questions for now, and then I'll be back with more.
Well, I'll definitely just send you a link to the deck so people can look at those slides in more detail, because I ran through them quickly on purpose. And in terms of RDI support, so we only support groups. We don't support candidates. We don't have a PAC. So we support C3 and C4 organizations. So we'll support the groups that are working in Ohio that are doing voter turnout that will impact the Sherrod Brown race. We won't support the Sherrod Brown race directly. So if people are candidates running, I'm sorry, we can't actually support you with our money. But I'd still love to know about you and your races. And we do have a lot of individual donors that are part of our network that would be interested to hear about promising local candidates in particular. So when I send the deck, I'll include my email address, and just feel free to reach out to me directly.
And then one prospective donor in the chat was wanting to know whether you'd want C3 and or C4 at this point. Is one better than the other? And if it's C4, they were wondering if you have any data on the cost per vote for the work that you're doing.
Yes. So we love for donors to be part of the RDI community, and it's a fun learning community, and you get to know a lot of what's happening with these 150 groups across our network, and you can make a big difference together. We have a lot of grassroots contributors, folks who are giving $100, $500, $1,000. So you don't have to be a giant donor to be part of the RDI donor community. And you can just go to our website, and there are instructions about how to make a contribution. We take both C3 and C4, but of course C4 dollars are always more valuable because you can spend them directly on politics. They're scarce and valuable. So I recommend if it's all the same to you, you should always just give C4 or PAC money. But if some people have their money in a donor advised fund or need the tax advantage, C3 money can also be put to great use for nonpartisan voter engagement. Did that answer the questions?
Yeah, I think that's good. Anthony, should I get to a couple of the more substantive ones from the chat before we go back to raised hands? You're on mute.
All right. Why don't we take Phil's question and then go back to you, Erica? Go ahead, Phil. Phil, you need to come off.
Okay. Phil Gerson here in Seattle. I'm a member of Braver Angels, and I've concluded that the rural-urban divide is the most strategic project that that we all can undertake. Of course, Braver Angel is trying to bring both sides together. So I would say 95% of all the counties in the country have urban-rural issues. You know, it's so pervasive, and it brings to the table people who are economically challenged and so forth, you know, and have the gripes. And so I love the information you have. While I lean blue, I would like to discuss approaches because we had our convention and people realized this could start a movement in some way between a lot of different organizations. So I'd like to be able to contact you, look at the data on your site, and see how we could merge some of this together. But thank you for all the work that you've done.
Thank you. I agree. And you've come to the right place with the Rural Urban Bridge Initiative. I believe in bridging that rural urban divide.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll say that if you get Ruby, in a way you get Sarah too, because we're so closely connected. If she has information or analysis that we don't have, if they have connections, they're just a tremendous resource to us as well as to individuals. Erica, let's go back to you for one or two of those substantive questions.
Okay, well, someone was curious about what role redistricting is playing in the North Carolina legislative races.
In which legislative races?
North Carolina.
I don't have the answer to that question because I'm not our North Carolina program officer. But I do know that that they just need to they have a reasonable path to being able to win to defeat the supermajority there.
Mm-hmm.
Even
Okay.
after redistricting.
And then there were a few kind of questions and comments about abortion and the polling that was done, kind of going in a couple different directions. One is, do you have a sense, or did your poll test the extent to which rural voters are aware that a Trump presidency could mean a federal ban on abortion? And then kind of going in the other direction, did your poll test any of the kind of more nuanced issues around abortion? So rather than just, you know, I'm for it or against it, like what about federal funding for abortions? What about abortions after 15 or 20 weeks? Those kinds of issues.
Yeah, we didn't test the more nuanced abortion issues because we just have limited space in our poll. I mean, we do find that every time they've run a statewide abortion ballot measure that we've seen more votes for the abortion measure than the Democrat, if that makes sense, right? So rural areas do better for abortion than they do for kind of their baseline Democratic percentage. So we think that that is very positive, kind of no matter what the question is on the ballot. And then I forget what the first part of that question was.
Oh, do you think that voters are aware, rural voters are aware of the potential for an federal abortion ban? I
think that rural voters are probably as aware as any voters, which is not that aware of what the threat that we're under. The one thing I will say is that as you find in most polling, but it's probably more pronounced in the rural polling, that rural voters don't know who stands for which policies. So they're with us on policies, but like, actually, I think I have the, it's one of our slides that shows that like 30% of folks think that it's actually Donald Trump that is for abortion rights and not Joe Biden, right? They have a lot of it backwards in terms of who is supporting what. So people get confused when it comes to making the correlation between an issue they care about and then how they're actually going to vote on a candidate, and they really need it spelled out for them.
Okay.
Is that it for now, Erica?
Well, there's more, but maybe we should go to some hands.
Okay, let's do it. Jacqueline.
Thanks, Anthony. Sarah, great presentation. The Missouri Democratic Party Rural Caucus has bought radio ads, 30-second spots in rotation. They're going to begin next week. Well, I got a call from the representative of the radio station saying, hey, since the pundits are, they're saying that Joe Biden should step aside and blah, 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 should we address that? Where our ads are focusing on Democratic policy, not individuals, but policy in the state of Missouri. So well, how do you feel like we need to handle that? Just stay within the local policy, like Missouri, stay with Missouri local policy and just leave it at that?
You mean as opposed to naming a specific candidate?
Yes, like Joe Biden, ask him, what's our stance on stepping aside and all that stuff. Just I'm for just keeping it local, Missouri, rather than the national news. I mean, what do you think about that?
I would be in favor of focusing on issues. That's where you're going to get the most traction and agreement and be able to kind of build the biggest base. I will say that all this is breaking news about the potential of Biden stepping aside and another candidate or another ticket coming into play. Most of the groups in the RDI network are not naming Biden as part of their grassroots voter engagement. Most of them are focusing on a legislative candidate, a local candidate, the sheriff's race, whatever that might be, or they're focusing on like the North Carolina governor's race. And they find that as soon as they bring Biden into it, then they lose kind of support and credibility amongst a big part of their constituency. Which is really unfortunate, and is one of the things that has been most concerning to me about this presidential race. So that's where we still are, and if things change and it will probably become necessary to educate people about what their choices are very quickly, you might want to consider some kind of locally, culturally appropriate way to introduce the new ticket to people.
Thank you. We're at 5 till 5. Sarah has a few extra minutes, but she has another call shortly after this one. So we've got 2 more questions in the queue. I'm going to ask them and then go back to Erica for more questions from the chat. And I got to say, y'all have been stellar in keeping your questions focused and really substantive. And we haven't had a single long rant. I'm kind of shocked. But I'm thrilled. So thank you for being such a great crowd. Alex, you're up next.
Yeah, thanks. So you guys fund small groups, Sarah, is that correct? So maybe those groups are too small to do randomized controlled trials. They don't have enough money. Do you actually have any data on how many votes you think they're actually producing?
You asked the cost per vote question. We fund large and small groups. So some of the groups that we fund are giant. Like we fund like Galvanize USA that has a $30 million budget and it has a huge amount of voter contact. Even groups like Down Home North Carolina is going out and working to knock on 500,000 or 1 million doors. So they do have the ability to run randomized control trials, some of them. Especially the ones that are doing large scale canvassing. I don't have like I don't have a cost per vote number for our strategies and tactics because they are so varied. It really, it differs by group, geography, constituency, right? We have groups that are really drilling in on like young people or young Asian American folks in rural North Carolina. So they're working on a particular constituency. And frankly, I'm not a huge fan of the cost per vote metric unless you're really just thinking about campaign specific tactics, because the power of the work that our groups do is year round. So when, again, like if you're working with immigrant voters to make sure that they have access to driver's licenses so that they can get to their jobs, and then you're recruiting a candidate who is in favor of that, and that takes you a year to work with all those folks, make all those connections, recruit the candidate, run them. And then at the end of the cycle, you're out there telling people to vote for that person. That's not the right place to measure a cost per vote, if that makes sense. I also believe that if you need to win something, you need to win it at whatever cost. So you use your cheapest tactics first, right? Like whatever is your like cheapest way to move voters. And usually what happens if you're in a rural place is you end up with not enough votes to win, right? You end up with like 42%. And then you have to figure out a way to get that other 8%. And you're going to have to use expensive tactics to do that. And that's okay, because the most important thing is that you're getting the people in place who are going to be champions for your issues. So I have a little bit of a nuanced analysis of the cost per vote metric.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I just want to make sure that the effect isn't zero before I give money.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, there are things that are more or less cost effective, like yard signs has about a 2% impact that they have been able to measure, and they're very inexpensive. It's a very inexpensive field campaign that you can run. Deep canvassing is quite expensive, but they have like an 8% impact on voters, right? So if you need to win and you have used up all your cheap tactics, that is a great one that we know is highly, highly effective. It just is, it's on the more expensive end. And so I think a mix of strategies and tactics that can get you to your win is what I end up looking for. And you can be assured that we are evaluating the impact and effectiveness. I just don't always put it on a cost per vote basis.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Sarah. Dave, you're the last person with the raised hand. We're going to go back to the chat after your question. Go ahead, Dave.
Thanks. Got a quick one. Just a quick comment about disinformation. I noticed there's a question in the chat about Fox News and the disinformation there, but I was reading just yesterday about Sinclair, which owns a lot of local newspapers, and the sort of biased content they're providing there. Is that just a fact of life and just steepens the hill we need to climb, or do you have other perspective on that? Thank you, and thanks for a great presentation.
You're welcome. It's really fun to be part of this, and I'm so thrilled that so many of you all showed up and stayed engaged the whole time. I think that local newspapers are an absolute community treasure. It's where so many people get their news and information, just coming from, I grew up in a small town. My family's, all my family members live in small towns now. They all religiously read their local paper, right? It's a fun way to get news about your community, and you get some political news at the same time. So we support the National Trust for Local News, which is actually buying up local newspapers and holding them in a trust in different parts of the country with a shared back end for efficiencies, and usually a flagship paper that is making money, whereas some of the other ones are losing money. They're finding a way to protect and preserve these local news outlets. So I just want to say I'm a huge champion for the local papers. One thing that you can do is advertise in local papers. If you're a group or a candidate and then you're getting money to these treasures. Of course, the Sinclair owned papers are not as much treasures, but it's again why I'm saying we should find ways to bring them into our ownership, whether it is like just like a good community-minded small business person, or whether it is in some of these larger trusts so that we can protect them from Sinclair. I would say that the Sinclair is not as bad at like just straight out disinformation, is more like misinformation. you know, the disinformation, a lot of that is coming from the digital sources where they're actually incentivized and making a profit from spreading disinformation, right? Because the more disinformation people consume, the more people come to their site, the more money they make then on advertising. And so that's a really, it's a terrifying, vicious cycle that is super, super dangerous. And the best way I think to combat that is through influencers. So people who are, you know, who have an influential circle of social and digital media, and making sure that they have high quality information. So like one of the things that we did was we just supported the Black Male Voter Project to bring together a convening of battle rap leaders, which I, you know, barely even know what battle rap is, but they're extremely influential with Black men that are kind of the furthest away from civic engagement. And they have like, you know, millions of people following them, and we're getting no support to have high quality information about the election. So they brought them together in a 3-day convening to make sure that they are now networked together and they can interrupt these disinformation sources. I think we need to do more of that.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll mention that Leslie put in the chat about States Newsroom as a good source of information as well. So check that out. We are at the hour. We're going to take some questions from the chat, and we have one more raised hand. Let me just mention that next briefing in August, the first Wednesday, I believe, is the 5th of August. No, I'm sorry, the 7th of August, 4 p.m. We will have our own Erica Edelson presenting a new Ruby resource, which is a combination, actually two distinct ones, one focused on communicating effectively in rural and across the divide, and the second around depolarizing techniques and strategies for campaigns themselves. So that is still being finalized, but that should be a fantastic presentation as well by Erica. So I will punt now to Erica to give us another question or two from the chat.
Yep. So someone wanted to know, you had mentioned some of the highest profile U.S. Senate races that you're following, and that there's groups that are doing great work there in support of those campaigns. And can you rename those groups so that people can plug in?
Yeah, there's more than what I named, but I just named the 3 that I had named was Western Native Voice in Montana, mobilizing Native voters, ruralorganizing.org in Ohio, which is really the only group doing rural first work in the state of Ohio. And I mentioned Rural Arizona Action in Arizona, which is just a fantastic scaled up rural organizing group working throughout rural Arizona.
Great, thanks.
That it, Erica?
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take the final question. We'll go to Beth Ruck, and let me just say again, as with Sarah, I'm just thrilled and pleased. We were a little nervous too about holding our briefing the day before July 4th, but it looks like all of you decided it doesn't take that long to throw a few hamburgers and hot dogs on a grill, and you are going to spend your time well on the 3rd of July. So thanks very much. And Sarah, wonderful, wonderful presentation. So delighted to have you. So thanks in advance. And Beth, take us away with your last question.
Yeah, thanks. Super pragmatic question. And thanks, Sarah. Nice to see you. Great presentation. I'm working in upstate New York on New York 19 and a couple of very, very local races up there. But the local campaigns are having a really hard time hiring campaign managers. And so I'm wondering what you think are the best, very pragmatic sort of how to run a campaign resources out there that can help give some guidance in lieu of having great campaign managers.
I think the best thing to do if you don't have a great campaign manager is make sure that you have a good kind of campaign consulting shop working with a less experienced campaign manager, but somebody who is just like well organized and can do the job. So I was just talking yesterday there's a group called Rural West Project. They work in the Rural West, so not in New York 19. But they will probably have ideas about some rural competent campaign consultants, because that's what they do. They actually have campaign consulting shops that then work with all the different campaigns and make sure that they have the highest caliber campaign advice. So I'm happy to make that connection with you directly, Beth. And then I'll also say our our communications director, Michael Shemidis, lives in New York 19, and he's run a ton of campaigns there, and he knows everyone in that community and might be a great resource for you.
Fabulous. Thanks.
Great. Well, we'll let you all go. Thank you again for participating. Terrific discussion. Fabulous presentation. Glad to be here, and hopefully see most of you next month when Erica Edelson unveils the great findings from our work on communications and depolarizing campaigns.
Thanks
Ciao.
so much, everyone. I love spending the afternoon with you.
Thank you, Sarah.